The day they started laying asphalt through my soybean field, I thought it was a prank, some kid with a heavy hand and a sense of humor that doesn't land. Then a crew showed up with a bobcat and a man in a suit who pointed at a map like it was scripture, and I realized this was not a joke. It was deliberate, organized, and aimed right at the middle of everything I'd built to get away from the noise. My name's Ethan Carter. I grew up on this land, left for a long stretch to do airport inspections for the state, boring desk work mostly, but enough to know how things get done when they're done by the book. And then, when my dad died, I moved back to keep the place from turning into someone else's history lesson. I wanted quiet, a porch that creaked in the evening, and a mailbox with rust where the paint had flaked off. I got all that, until the morning Marjorie Voss walked onto my property in heels and a blazer and called it progress. She was the kind of person who smelled like citrus and confidence, whose laugh arrived a beat early and stayed too long. Marjorie ran the Willowbrook Association, the local HOA that liked to make rules for everyone else's yards and call it community upkeep. I met her that day at the survey stakes. Pink flags, orange spray paint, a string line that marched through my beans like it owned the place. She smiled at me the way someone smiles before delivering bad news and said, "We voted. It's for the neighborhood." She said it like she'd already printed the brochures. "You can't just," I started. "I've never much liked confrontation, but I will defend my land." She cut me off with a hand the size of a dinner plate. "Majority rules, Ethan. We're doing this for property values." She said the words like a benediction. Property values. For them, land was spreadsheets and future sales, not the place where I buried my father's watch. They paved in the dark, literal night shifts, engines humming while my dog howled and my livestock stamped, and I sat on the porch in the dark, listening like a witness to a quiet, small-scale war. They mailed notices with tiny print, fines for obstructions that they had planted on my driveway, an HOA sign that appeared overnight on the edge of my field claiming part of the property as an access easement. Every move was passive-aggressive, and neat lawyers do that neatness: piles of paper, polite ultimatums, lines about community benefit. It felt like watching someone pull the curtains while they took the whole house. I tried the normal things first: emails, town meetings, the HOA's own paperwork. The HOA had members who liked the idea of a fly-in community, a private strip where select planes could land and owners could brunch in the clubhouse and call it a lifestyle. There were whispers about investors, about a glossy brochure, about a couple of out-of-towners who'd already put down deposits. My neighbors were split. Some wanted the convenience, some feared the noise. Nobody wanted the fight except me, apparently. Maybe because I had nowhere to go. I was careful. My old job taught me to be careful, to document, to notice the small discrepancies that stack into fraud. I set up trail cams, the kind you buy at the Ranger store, and took photos of the equipment, the license plates, the men who looked at me like I was an inconvenient duck in their parade. I recorded conversations when people got careless, because human beings with secrets lose them in the sound of their own voices. I found receipts that contradicted what the HOA had filed. I found a survey that didn't match the deed in my glove box. And I found a string of emails where Marjorie had been congratulating an investor months before anyone told the community. Motive, it turns out, is the thing that ties all the little lies together. At the HOA meeting, I got up and put my deed on the podium like an accusation. The room was half chairs and half air conditioning, a mix of folks in work boots and folks in clean shirts. Marjorie presented slides, charts with arrows, pictures of imagined terraces, renderings of planes in a blue sky. She had that practice smile. When I showed the deed and the survey, she laughed just enough to tell everyone there was drama, and then she said, in front of everyone, "You're making this personal, Ethan." I heard it like a verdict. Personal, as if love of the land was some quaint eccentricity on par with paperweight collections. Things escalated. A truck flattened my mailbox and left a note that said to discuss later. One night someone put spray paint on the barn, sell in block letters. A local reporter came by, curious about the spectacle, and Marjorie stood in front of the camera and talked about vision. Her supporters liked the idea of the runway because it sounded luxurious. Opponents didn't have a catchy name for what they were losing. In the meantime, equipment kept showing up before dawn, and the county let them work like no one was watching. That's how these things happen: momentum, built on polite paperwork and the assumption that the person with less time or less money will fold. I kept finding contradictions. There was a permit application with dates that didn't line up, a notarized statement that had been signed in a city 2 hours away during the time Marjorie swore she was at a town board meeting. Small things that, when you pile them together, look like a house of cards built on somebody's eagerness. I called an old friend from the aviation days not to flex credentials. I hate that, but because he knew how to read the red tape. He said, if it smells like a runway scam, it probably is. That was the faint, ridiculous comfort of technical confirmation. The turning point came when Marjorie, in a show that only she could love, planned a grand opening of the Strip Champagne, a rented biplane, a ribbon stretched across my field like a theater prop. People came out of curiosity. A few came with binoculars and a sense of Sunday afternoon entertainment. She announced it on social media like an event, and the whole thing felt less like development and more like a performance. I showed up because what else was there to do? You don't get to watch your front yard become someone's stage and not show up. She was radiant on the podium. This is for the community, she said, and she meant it the way a drill sergeant means unity with command, not conversation. A small plane took off, or tried to. The pilot glanced at his instruments and cursed under his breath. The strip wasn't finished, the compaction was wrong, and the last thing we needed was a plane in a field that had been a soybean crop that morning. That's when I stepped forward. I didn't have to yell. I didn't want to sound like the kind of guy who shouts. I reached into my jacket and produced some paperwork, old certifications from way back when I'd done inspections, letters from regulators, the kind of dry admin things that make people reroute their plans. Marjorie's face changed in a way I hadn't seen. The practice smile clipped. She tried to maintain the narrative, to keep the lights on and the cameras warm, but when legal authority shows up in the form of a man who used to read the rules for a living, people get very practical. I read a cease and desist aloud, not for drama, for obligation, and the pilot aborted the landing. There was a moment of hush, like a movie where you can hear the grass exhale. Someone in the back muttered about overreach. Someone else clapped, because finally someone did something sensible, and Marjorie's supporters looked like they'd been asked to empty pockets on stage. After that, the county sent inspectors, the state sent letters, and the investors called their lawyers. Marjorie put on a face of indignation that would have been convincing if it hadn't been backed by a paper trail most politicians wish they had. Emails, receipts, tied names. Turns out people write things down when they're excited and forget that words live. She was removed as president of the association, pending an investigation, and in the court of public opinion, a lot of people started rewriting their past choices. The strip was torn up. The machines left, like a swarm that suddenly realized there was no nectar. We won, in the technical sense. The asphalt was ripped up, the legal filings moved forward, and the county put markers back where they belonged. But there's another kind of victory, the one that smells different, older, dustier. I lost a few acres to temporary damage. My field needed time to heal, and the neighborhood became a place where people had to admit they'd been tempted by quick money. The social fabric, that quiet web of neighborly trust, had frayed. Some friendships got patched, others didn't. Marjorie moved away a few months later, but the conversations she started kept airing out like laundry. Whose idea of community do we buy into, and who gets to decide? People asked me if I felt vindictive. I don't think so. There was anger, sure, the kind that makes you sharpen your words, but beneath it was this stubborn, simple love for a field, for a man who used to fix the gravel on this road, for the creek in the porch swing that has the pattern of my father's weight still in it. At the end of the day, I'm just a guy who wanted what my dad wanted, a place where you can hear crickets without advertisements. If there's a takeaway, it's one you've probably heard before, but it's true. Power prefers the loud and the polished, and it's efficient at making things feel inevitable. Paperwork, momentum, and an idea dressed up in a brochure can steamroller the quiet if nobody bothers to notice the fine print. The only real deterrent is people who know the rules and aren't afraid to use them, not for spite, but because the rules exist to make sure progress doesn't become theft. And sometimes progress is nothing more than a new name for greed. So tell me, in the comments, what would you have done? Would you have let them pave and hoped for a payout? Or would you have stood on your porch and taken the fight? Drop a comment with what justice means to you, whether community is about uniform lawns or something deeper, and if you've ever seen a small town choose profit over people. If you found this story worth your time, share it, hit the like, and tell a friend, because stories like this stick with us, not for the asphalt, but for the choices we make when someone else decides our land belongs to them.